Welcome to African American Conservatives, the soul of the conservative movement. I'm your host, Marie Strader. Please like, follow, subscribe at brightnews.com, anchor.fm/AACONS, or at AACONS, AACONS.substack.com. Leonydus Johnson is a podcaster, an actor, director, musician, hip hop artist, and speech language pathologist. He's also the author of Raising Victims: The Pernicious Rise of Critical Race Theory. Welcome to the show, Leonydus.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
There are few issues today as discussed, diagnosed, and debated as critical race theory, or CRT. But as you point out, part of the ongoing debate is over how CRT is properly defined. One of CRT's leading proponents, Professor Ibram X. Kendi, says this about it, quote, "When we think of racial inequality in this country, I think it's important for us to recognize that historically we've been arguing over why that inequality exists. The racist position has stated that inequality exists because there is something inferior or superior about different racial groups, whether culturally, behaviorally, genetically, and the anti-racist position has largely stated that inequality is the result of policy and racist policy. So therefore, the problem isn't bad people, the problem is bad policy. And it's important, if you want to eliminate inequality, to identify those bad policies and replace them with the type of policies that can create equity and justice for all," end quote. Is CRT just the elimination of bad policies that create racism, or do you define CRT differently?
So the founders of CRT would tell you that that's exactly what it is. It's a system for trying to root out the invisible racism that's inherent in our institutions. But it goes a lot deeper than that. And they'll even admit that they are suspicious of the Constitution, the foundational structures of our country, Western culture itself, and that they are antagonistic toward those things because they believe that the entire system, the entire structure of Western society has been formed around white supremacy. So it's Antonio Gramsci's idea of cultural hegemony, which Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist. And cultural hegemony is this idea that the people in power create this system in society, the status quo, and that benefits themselves and oppresses everybody else, even to the point where it's status quo and it's the normal everyday operations of things, and the people who are being oppressed don't even recognize that they're being oppressed. They think it's just normal. They think it's just the everyday operations of things. And so they need to be made conscious. And then again, this comes back into Marx's idea of class consciousness, which we can replace class with race, and think that, people need to be made conscious of their racial plight and the racial oppression. So they realize that even though they can't see racism directly, they don't see direct evidence of racism. But since racial disparities occur in these systems, that's the evidence that the systems themselves are racist. And Ibram X. Kendi has said that explicitly, that any system that yields racial disparities is evidence of a racist system. Now, what it doesn't take into account is all of the other variables that drive disparities between individuals. Inequality doesn't necessarily need to be driven by genetics or driven by oppression or bias. It could be driven by all kinds of different variables: culture, behavior, attitudes, whether or not you have an internal or external locus of control. There's an infinite number of variables between two individuals that make up differences in outcomes. And Thomas Sowell always says that the same person isn't even equal to himself on different days. So the idea that we can somehow change systems and craft equal outcomes it's nonsense. But that's exactly what critical race theory promotes.
Professor Kendi also says Quote, another misnomer about critical race theory is that it's anti white or racist. And I don't think people realize that one of the oldest and most vile white supremacist it's one of the most vile white supremacist talking points, end quote. Is it a white supremacist talking point, or do you find that CRT, in fact, is racist?
It's absolutely racist. What it does is it's trying to upend the perceived hierarchy. So the perceived hierarchy is that white supremacy is imbibed in the system. So it's trying to upend that. And again, I'll quote Ibram X. Kendi back to him. The idea that you have to engage in discrimination, present discrimination, in order to remedy past discrimination, or you need to engage in future discrimination to remedy present discrimination. So he uses the word discrimination, but it's racism. If you're discriminating on racial lines, that's racism. And I know progressives are trying to change the definition of racism and make it seem like you have to have some kind of institutional power in society, which they've redefined that too, because clearly Black people also have institutional power.
Yes.
But the idea that Black people don't have any kind of institutional power whatsoever and therefore can't be racist, it's outrageous. That's the only way that idea works. But they explicitly market, and by the way, equity itself requires inequality. So they specifically promote and market the idea of discriminating along racial lines. And I don't know what else to call that other than racism.
That's right. Now, you wrote, quote, what is also often forgotten in these discussions is that there are often more significant intragroup disparities than intergroup disparities. If disparities automatically equal bias, then how do we explain why Black people who engage in different cultural behaviors experience significantly different outcomes, end quote? Would you expand upon what you mean by intragroup disparities within the African American community and how they help explain the significantly different outcomes you reference?
Yeah, well, a lot of times the only disparities that matter in these conversations is the disparities between Black people as a collective group and white people as a collective group. And nobody ever looks at any of the other variables or any other groups or even at the individual level. And if you look within groups, you look at such significant outcomes between Black people. You take one Black individual and take another Black individual. One has abysmal outcomes. One is, LeBron James or somebody, somebody that's doing very, very well for themselves. And then you say, okay, what's the difference? If disparities automatically equal bias, then we have to assume that LeBron is benefiting from some kind of bias system, whereas the other Black person is not, or they're under the boot of oppression somehow. And honestly, that's what they'll even tell you, because I've had this discussion with people before, and I said, well, okay, like I don't really experience racism directly, other than from white liberals who want to be a white savior and tell me I have internalized white supremacy or something like that. I was like, am I a magic Black person? And like, what is going on here? Why is my life? Why am I experiencing success to a certain degree without any sort of oppression? And they tell me that I benefit from white privilege, that I do have internalized white supremacy, and I benefit from white privilege. And so it becomes this very pseudoscientific sort of post hoc way of explaining away the evidence. Because if you look at any population that engages in personal responsibility, an internal locus of control, a good work ethic, valuing education, doesn't, rejecting promiscuity and having children out of wedlock. Things, I mean, very basic, basic things that we would say these are good cultural behaviors. If you look at any group of people, any individual, any group of people that engages that and embraces those behaviors, they have positive outcomes. And so it makes no sense really to reject those variables and say that, oh, just because there's differences between these two racial groups, those are due to bias, but the differences within the groups, those are due to something else. And you can look at white people as well. And you say, like, okay, like, look at these successful white people and look at these not so
Yeah.
successful white people. And what is the difference? What are the variables that drive those disparities? And why do those variables not matter when we're talking about intragroup or intergroup disparities? So
That's so interesting that you say that, because yesterday on Facebook, one of my friends that I went to high school with back in the Stone Ages, sorry, Mark, one of my friends that I went to high school with posted on his Facebook page an article from MSN that said America hates Black people. And I kind of pushed back gently because, there was this whole discussion about, reparations, and, we need to have equity, and, all these DEI policies and all of this other stuff to level the playing field. And I kind of
mm,
gently pushed back and I said, wait a minute. And it's to your point. I said, what about resilience in our community as a motivator to get out of poverty or whatever situation we might be in? What about these external character or these internal characteristics that are not outward things? Because I said there's no college that I can't go to that if I want to go there. There's no
right.
sign that says, white people only. There's no workplace that says whites only. None of that. So I mean, I don't understand why we're having this discussion that it's always a racial thing. Education is a wonderful thing, and that's what got me out of poverty,
Mm,
and I know it did for a lot of other people, including my friend who posted this. And so I feel like we automatically go to this kind of crutch of victimhood rather than I didn't like my situation, so I improved it. And people will say, oh, well, but you're lucky, you're special, you're this, you're that. No, it's hard work, because what did slaves do after they were freed? They couldn't read, most of them, they couldn't write, most of them. So, I
right.
mean, what was it? Was self-determination, it was resilience. Those are characteristics that are internal and inherent. And those are things that you don't learn necessarily, other than maybe through hard experience, that
Yeah.
those characteristics come out. So, to your point, that's absolutely right.
Yeah. In I think internal is the primary word there, because you have and I think I mentioned locus of control earlier. You have an internal locus of control, which means that you have control over your life. You feel like you have
Right.
your hands on the steering wheel and you can shape your own destiny. That doesn't mean that things won't happen that are out of your control, but when you have an internal locus of control, you recognize that even if things happen that you can't control, you still control how you respond to those things. And so you have agency, you have
Right.
strength, and
Right.
you said resiliency. I like that word. But what critical race theory and this sort of victim mentality teaches is an external locus of control. It teaches children specifically that they don't have control of their outcomes, that no matter what they do, there's always this system acting upon them and these external forces to tear them down. And what that does is that it disempowers them. It's disempowering, and it teaches us a sense of learned helplessness. Where I mean, if you feel like no matter what you do, you're always going to be knocked back down, why try? Why, if you have excuses at the ready, if you can just blame racism for your failures, then why try? Like, it's going to be, racism is going to knock you down anyway. So I look at a school system like Baltimore, where it just has
Yes.
abysmal outcomes. And I talk about Baltimore all the time. It just drives me
Yes.
crazy
So
because, I
do
mean, it's
we.
like,
Yes,
I
I
mean,
know.
but it's mostly run by Black people. And, the
Democrats. I mean,
superintendent,
the
and
left.
right, exactly.
Those who
And
say
yet
that school choice is a
abysmal
bad thing.
outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah.
just awful. Yeah, I think it's like 7% proficient in math and like 12%
Yes. That
proficient
new
in language
report
arts.
that just came out. Yes.
Yeah, just
Absolutely.
absurd. And so,
It's
and yet
abysmal.
when you talk to people about it, they'll still blame systemic racism, and they'll still say,
Yes.
well, it's like, and it's also one of the highest funded school systems in the country, so they can't
Yes.
even blame funding anymore. So
We
it's like,
talked about this just last week. We said, we throw money at this. We've thrown money at it for decades. We were talking to Alan West, and I said, I'm 58 years old. I can't remember a time when the right was in control of Baltimore or Oakland or Detroit or LA or any of these
Right.
metropolitan inner city urban areas where children are failed, you just completely failed by the public school system. And yet the answer is to throw more money at it. And it
Yeah.
hasn't solved it in decades. I mean, it's really literally been 60, 70 years. And
Long
so,
time.
what is the answer then? I mean, if we keep throwing money at it and Johnny still cannot read, that seems to tell you that that's not the answer. And so I homeschooled my 3 children. I was not going to put my Black children in a failing school. And I've got a kid that graduated college with a degree, a bachelor's degree at the age of 20. My daughter is already established as a vet tech in her career. And my youngest, he has some cognitive issues, but he thrives I mean, because I was able to do some one-on-one with him, he got up to grade in a lot of things pretty quickly. So, we have our kids trapped in these failing schools. And
Yeah.
yet, like you said, it's always this external agency. And when we try to do something about it, like the women who were arrested for crossing zip codes to put their children in better schools, that was a crime.
See, yeah, that's outrageous. And we homeschool our kids too for
Wonderful.
many of the same reasons. But yeah, parents need to have that choice. Why would you want parents to keep their kids trapped in failing schools? It makes no sense. But I like to tell the story of Nemo in Finding Nemo and Gil and the relationship between them in the fish tank. And I don't know if you remember that part when Nemo gets stuck in the filter tank or in the filter tube, and he's freaking out because he's scared and his fin doesn't work very well. He's having a bad time, and all the other fish in the tank, they start freaking out. It's like, we got to help him. We got to get him out of there. And Gil's like, nobody touch him. Nobody touch him. Right. Because Gil recognized that Nemo had the capacity, he had the strength, he had the fortitude, he had the ability to swim out on his own. And he didn't want Nemo to have that sort of internalized victimhood where
Yes.
to think that he couldn't do it. He could have. Gil could have come into that and said, oh, you know what? Yeah, you have a gimpy fin. It's not fair that you're stuck in that tube. None of the other fish are stuck in the tube. This is inequitable. We have to have equity here. We need to get you out, or we need to put the other fish in the tube so it's fair.
Or
Whatever.
special program. Yes.
Right. We need to do something. Something. It's not your fault you're in the tube. This is terrible. But he didn't do any of that. He told Nemo to swim out on his own, and he convinced him that he had the strength and ability and the courage to do that. And that's what we need to be teaching children in these schools, that even if you're in adverse circumstances and you're facing obstacles, you have the power to take control of your own destiny, and you have the strength and fortitude to overcome it, and not blame your external circumstances, not look for excuses. Just do it. Just swim out of the tube, man.
Now, you just mentioned your children. So, and you mentioned your children in your book, Raising Victims. How
Yes.
have you handled the challenges of being an involved parent during a time when CRT and other Marxist teachings are so prevalent?
Yeah, well, so we're pretty fortunate. We live in a pretty conservative area of southeastern Ohio, and that hasn't quite crept in as much as other areas in the country. So we've been able to shield them a little bit from that. And in homeschooling, we've been able to take control.
Yes.
But as far as the race stuff goes specifically, our kids have family members that span the spectrum of human variation. We have people of all different races in our family, of all different skin colors. And so we don't teach our children to have a specific racial identity or to internalize racial identity as a massive part of who they are. And like, even all 4 of my kids, like they have different skin colors, and they actually get lighter as they get younger. And we used to joke that it looks like a printer running out of ink. Line them all up.
Oh,
But
wow.
they recognize the differences between each other. Like, one of my daughters has blue eyes even, and they understand the differences, but it doesn't matter. They have white family members, they have Black family members, they have a Puerto Rican family. I mean, it spans the spectrum. So they don't see race as consequential to who they are yet, thankfully. We've been able to avoid that for the most part. But as far as what else is going on in the culture, it's very concerning because I don't want that sort of attitude to sneak into that siren song to sneak into their minds, because it's very alluring. It's very tempting to go down that path, because there's so much emotion attached to it, and there's so much it really pulls people into it because it's very, I mean, if you have an excuse for your failures, or if people will incentivize you to behave a certain way and to say, yes, I am a victim, which our society does. It says like, oh yeah, oh, you poor victim, you, let me give you let me give you
Yeah.
accolades, and let me give you an Oscar, since whatever it may be.
Right.
But there's an incentive there to behave that way. So I hope they avoid it. And we try to teach them that, there are people in the world who care very much about skin color. And so that kind of covers the spectrum of it. But as far as us and our family, we don't see people that way. We recognize individual differences, and we treat people as individuals, and we meet them where they are. And like Martin Luther King said, we judge them by the content of their character and the fruit that they bear. So
That's absolutely right. We do the same thing. And having kids raised in church also helps. I mean, the homeschooling community is one
100%.
aspect of it, but also in church, you don't see people by their skin color. You see people by the way they treat each other. And so that's absolutely right. That's great that you're doing that with your kids. You say that CRT advocates are technically correct when they say that they are not teaching CRT in schools, but instead
Mm.
they use sleight of hand to get around prohibitions against teaching it. Can you expand upon some of those?
Yeah, sure. So there's the academic portion of critical race theory, which you attach the founders to, like people like Derek Bell or Richard Delgado or Kimberly Crenshaw. I mean, these people are they push the academic parts, and that's the part that is taught in universities, in law schools, in the School of Education, wherever. Uh, that stuff is not normally happening in K through 12 schools. They're not Teachers aren't passing out Richard Delgado textbooks or Kimberly Crenshaw essays. They're not doing that. But what's happening in K through 12 classrooms is applied theory, and you could think of it as critical race praxis rather than critical race theory. And an analogy I like to use is like a music teacher. A music teacher goes to college and studies advanced music theory, right? But when they go to teach kindergartners or first graders, they're not probably not going to be teaching them advanced music theory, but they're going to teach them how to sing the songs. And that's what's happening with critical race theory. They're not teaching them the advanced theory. They're teaching them how to sing the songs. And they're hiding that in diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Yes.
in social emotional learning,
Yes.
anti-racism initiatives, equity initiative, whatever it may be. All this sanitized cultural responsiveness, like all of these sanitized terms that seem on the surface like they're good things. Most people would agree, like, oh yeah, social emotional learning, that sounds great. We want diversity. Equity sounds like a good word, like, so most people would go along with that stuff. But underneath of it, they're infusing the more radical ideology, the idea that racism is endemic in society. It's interwoven into our very institutions. Slavery can explain why you're failing math class. I mean, it's just
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
nonsense. Yeah.
And the other piece of it that really disturbs me is that the pendulum has swung so far the other way that those sorts of programs are actually enacting a different sort of racism. And that's
Yeah.
against people who are Asian, people who are white, because, now they're the racial bias to get into schools. You don't have to take the SAT, you don't have to take the LSAT, you don't have to take, well, they push back on the LSAT, but math, you don't have to do all these, and we're going to dumb down the tests so that more of you can pass. If that's not the soft bigotry of low expectation, I don't know what it is, because that to
Yeah.
me, and then you've got people who are academically ready for the rigors of a 4-year course of study, who are not being admitted because they're white or because they're Asian or because they're some other overrepresented uh, racial ethnic group. And so I kind of pushed back on that recently, and I said, I want a doctor who's going to be able to perform the surgery. I don't care what race they are. I want the
Right.
best person for the job. And so there are rigors that are attached to 4-year learn institutions of learning. And so to have our children prepared for that, it's so funny because the senior year that we homeschooled my daughter, she had to write so much, and she was like, "Mom, really, please, no more writing, no more writing." And I'm like, "Girl, when you go next year, that is all you are going to do
That's
is
it.
write. You're going to do nothing but write." And
Right.
sure enough, she came back to me, "Mom, you were right." And I mean, she was thankful, but
Yeah.
I prepared
Yeah.
her for that, not because she was Black, but because she was going to be a college freshman. And that's what you do when you're in college. So,
Right.
those sorts of things are really fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, we mentioned Baltimore earlier, and another shocking statistic that comes out of Baltimore is that they're graduating like 70% of their students, which there's something wrong there,
Yes.
because if only 7% are proficient in math and 12% proficient in reading, where's that gap? How are you
Yes.
closing that gap? So they're graduating kids, and then these kids are going to college and getting into college and then failing out within,
And
a
it's
semester or
racist
two,
because they're
and
failing.
then call it racist.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like well, they're not prepared, and
No.
then Thomas Sowell talks about it too. Like even kids who don't do as abysmally, but maybe they graduate, middle of their class or whatever, but then they're getting admitted to like MIT or something like that, which they don't have the intellectual capacity to keep up with the rigor of the work. Then
Yes.
they would be much better served at a different college where they would excel and do fine. But because of these diversity initiatives, they get put in an environment where they cannot succeed. And then it's called racism, and it's outrageous. But
Absolutely right.
the diversity initiatives are, I mean, diversity itself is a good thing, I would say. Diversity as a natural occurring thing where people are building on diverse strengths and coming together as a team to make the team stronger. Sports is a good example of that. You need diversity on a football team. You need a quarterback, you need wide receivers, you need a running back, you need defense. You need all these people to fill these diverse roles, and when it all comes together, it creates a beautiful thing. It creates a strong football team. You can't have a team full of quarterbacks. It's not going to work. You're not going to win very many games. But what we're dealing with is this superficial, arbitrary diversity where people are being put in positions where it has nothing to do with the position itself. It's just like, oh, we want, like, stick with the sports analogy. It's like we need more blue-eyed quarterbacks or more 5'8" wide receivers. Like, why? Like, it makes no sense, just to fill the quota and fill it. And so in that sense, it's inherently weakness. It's an inherent weakness. It makes your team weaker. It makes whatever it is weaker. And I think specifically about the Supreme Court and Ketanji Brown Jackson. That's her name, right? And the whole idea of putting a racial and gender filter on
Yes.
that position. So she may very well have been the best person for the job, right?
Sure.
It's like it may very well have been, but by putting a racial and gender filter on that, what you're saying is that she was not the best person for the job.
That's right.
And the better options needed to be filtered out so that she would be the remaining best person for the job. And so, and if she were the best person for the job, that should be insulting to her, because she would have got it anyway. Why do you need the
Yeah.
racial and gender field? Why do you need that stigma? It's like lowering the rim to 6 feet and telling the defense to clear off so LeBron can dunk by himself. Like, if he's the best person on the court, why do you need to do that? You don't. It's
Right.
nonsense. So yeah, diversity is outrageous on many different fronts.
It was announced this week that there is a lawsuit being brought on by a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who is suing his school administrators for punishing him for speaking out against the school's promotion of CRT. In your experience, how much pressure is there for academics to be CRT advocates?
Oh man, it's huge because especially in the university level, because conservatives in the universities, and I forget the exact percentage, but it's very low. It's, I mean, maybe like 8% or something like that. That maybe even be too high. But when conservatives to progressive professors, like conservatives are the extreme minority in the university level. So you have a lot of groupthink that's happening on these college campuses, and there's not any sense of, well, we talk about diversity, there's not any sense of ideological diversity. There's no sense that people even want to pursue ideological diversity. So critical race theory is treated as a foregone conclusion, and that's one of the main issues with it. It wouldn't be such of a problem, because at the university level you learn all kinds of things, right? You learn Marxism, you can learn all kind you can learn about Hitler's ideology, um, but you're not applying it. It's not learning it to learn how to do it and how to implement it into your life so that you can take it out into public schools and corporations and that sort of thing. You're learning about it as a historical thing. It wouldn't be such a problem if that's what CRT was, but that's not what it is. It's an ideology that's being taught in universities, and it's being treated as incontrovertible truth in the foregone conclusion. So its presuppositions are treated as you can't challenge them, and if you do, then we're going to punish you in some manner, because you're being racist, you're being oppressive. Because if you embrace the idea that racism is endemic in society, that it's interwoven into the fabric of our institutions and hidden, and we can't see it only in racial disparities and racial outcomes. And if you believe that it's just the existence of white people or the existence of these systems oppresses Black people, then anybody speaking out against that is going to be part of that oppression, in your mind anyway. And so you have a duty to to eliminate that oppression and go. And that's what critical race theory teaches. Richard Delgado says specifically that there's two aspects to it. There's the academic portion that exists in universities, and then there's the activist portion. And they say, this was what makes it different. They have activists, they train up activists, they train up evangelists to send out into society to evangelize and proselytize and hunt down heretics to punish and that dismantle these institutions. So it's more of a religion than anything. It's not an academic discipline. It's definitely a worldview, and it's operates like an extremist religion. So it's tough.
When you say that, it makes me think of the Negro Project, with Margaret Sanger. Let's get the Negro minister to go out there and sell this terrible thing that's going to decimate this community. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And Planned Parenthood, they're very, very trepidatious about that. They don't want to distance themselves too far from Margaret Sanger, but they only recently acknowledged the more
Yes.
racist history of her, but they're very careful not to mention the more egregious things. But yeah, I mean, Sanger just yeah, I don't see how people don't see these things.
I don't either.
I don't know how they, other than just not looking deeper into the history, which I just talked to David Webb about that, and it's just this idea. People look on the surface and they hear certain things that sound they sound reasonable, or they sound sanitized, which is a huge tactic of critical race theory to push these ideas. And they hear those things and they don't look deeper into it, or they don't consider the broader implications. Like, it sounds like conspiracy theory when I tell people that, like, dude, this is rooted in Marxism. Like, they are Marxists, and they're aiming for cultural revolution. They say this explicitly. And it sounds it sounds like I'm off my rocker and talking about conspiracy, but that's actually what they're doing, and that's actually what they pursue. So it's an interesting thing, trying to get people to see the deeper ideology.
If you're just joining us, our guest this segment has been Leonydus Johnson. He is the author of Raising Victims: The Pernicious Rise of Critical Race Theory. Leonydus, how can our audience continue to follow your work and follow you online?
Yeah, my Twitter handle is @Leonydus Johnson. It's Leonydus Johnson. You can follow me on Facebook. It's the same thing, Leonydus Johnson. I have a Substack. It's leonydus.substack.com. And my website is leonydusjohnson.com. Make it easy.
Well, we're going to follow your Substack right after this. So we'll put you on our recommendation list. So
I appreciate that.
That's great having you on.
Likewise.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being our guest, and I hope you'll come back soon.
Absolutely. I appreciate you guys.
Thank you. All right. Well, this is the portion of the show where we bring DK in, get his take on things. Come on in, DK.
Buenos dias.
Well, hello, sir.
Oh, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Okay, that was an interesting interview.
Wasn't
Leonydus Johnson.
Yes. Homeschooling dad. I love it.
Wrote a very interesting book on CRT.
Yeah,
It's the first time really meeting him, but I'm impressed. Seems like a great guy.
I'm a fan. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk for a few minutes about Nikki Haley to kind of get your impression of what's going on. But
Nikki Haley, the one that's past her prime, according to Don Lemon.
Exactly.
I'm a little older than Nikki Haley, just a little bit. So I guess I'm a little, past the expiration date.
Well,
according to him.
I don't want to say anything.
Yeah, that's right, because you've got a birthday coming up and you'll be the same age as me. And I'm always telling people how old I am. So.
Oh, my God. Well, my expiration date might have passed. I had a very short shelf life, so you can't go by me. My prime lasted like 10 minutes in high school.
Yeah, don't tell Don Lemon that, though. He's being re-educated,
Oh, my goodness. That's always great, He
has to take some classes. So, of course, to Leonydus's point, it's going to be racism that, an educated Black man has to take classes. I think it's basic sensitivity training. You don't tell a woman that she's old.
They really believe in those re-education camps.
They do, don't they? They really enjoy those.
Jordan Peterson, the psychiatrist, is always on TV.
Yeah.
I heard Canada wanted to subject him to re-education, and he refused.
Yeah, good for him.
And I also heard, it's one of those, I think it was a Project Veritas undercover video, and some guy in the Bernie Sanders campaign said that once they win, he thought they were going to win, and once they win, that all of us conservatives who wouldn't go along with the Bernie Sanders message might have to be subject to re-education camps. So they really believe in that. I'm not surprised they sent Don Lemon to one.
Free pair of mittens with each registration. Yeah.
Oh, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Nikki Haley. We've never met her, but she seems to be a pretty impressive person. She's the first generation daughter of legal immigrants. She rose to become governor of a state that's 70% white and maybe 1% Asian. She went on to become a UN ambassador during the Trump years. And she's always been subject to these really bizarre attacks, in my opinion. First, as a gubernatorial candidate, which is when I first started to hear the name.
Yeah.
She was rumored to be having these extramarital affairs. It was just these weird rumors that we've seen other candidates get hit with, like
Herman Cain. Yep.
Who was the other one? Herschel Walker.
Yep.
All these people supposedly have all this private information they have to announce to the world as soon as they see a Republican running for office. And then when she became UN ambassador, there were these other rumors, at least from one best-selling author who was alleging that she was having an affair with Donald Trump. So
that was crazy. That was crazy.
It's been bizarre from the beginning. And then got Ann Coulter, who I used to admire a great deal, was
She's been on the show a few
offended
times.
that Nikki Haley and others apparently did not hold the Confederate flag in the same reverence as she did. Essentially told Nikki Haley to go back to India, which I thought was a horrible racist attack. There's also the incident on The View when Sunny Holston, whose real name is Asuncion, I think, but she goes by Sunny. she mocked Nikki Haley, whose real name is Nikki Haley, for going by the name Nikki Haley. And then, as you just alluded to, it's the whole Don Lemon thing where, he, for some reason, to Don Lemon, 51 years old for a politician is past the prime.
And yet he's a shill for the guy in the White House who's 80.
Which is why he said it, because she said something about politicians over, I think it was 75, should have some sort of cognitive test. So him being a shill had this knee-jerk response that she should go for a cognitive test because she's not in her prime either. It make no sense. Politicians are in their prime in their 50s, in my opinion. That's when they're really at their best.
We should run.
Yeah, I know.
See, look at that.
I've been running all my life. I never caught anything, but I'm still running. Yeah, I was just saying, 51 is kind of old for the WNBA, for the Olympic track team, but for a politician,
for presidents, no,
it's she's right in her prime. So it was just a New York response. He may be kind of sexist anyway, but
you think?
Yeah, because he has kind of a reputation of being sexist anyway. But
talking down to his co-host.
Yeah. Well, co-hosts can be annoying.
Especially those women. I know. Having a woman co-host
for that, but
she was critical of him too. So. I know he didn't like her being critical.
So anyway, I'm just saying that she's had a long history of enduring these weird, bizarre attacks from the left and the right. Yeah. And recently she came under another attack from a panel on MSNBC, which we can look at now.
Dora Neale Hurston, not all skin folk are kinfolk. She's the alpha Karen with brown skin. And for white supremacists and racists, she's the perfect Manchurian candidate. She uses her brown skin as a weapon against poor black folks and poor brown folks. And she uses her brown skin to launder white supremacist talking points.
I just wanted to mention that because we've talked so much about how black Republicans, as soon as they become prominent, they start to endure these weird racial attacks, normally from people.
Larry Elder, he's the black face of white supremacy.
Who are also black. They just trot these black progressives out to make these racial attacks against black Republicans. We've seen it with Larry Elder. He was called the black face of white supremacy. We've seen it with Allen West. We've seen it with Byron Donaldson, the great congressman.
Byron Donaldson.
We've seen it with Tim Scott.
Oh, yes. Token. They call him Token with regularity. Yeah.
So my theory is that either they're progressives who either believe that anyone outside their progressive bubble is indeed a spokesperson for white supremacy, or there are people who are willing to say that for money. And I think it's often the latter. And I'll end with that.
I absolutely agree with you on that point. And with that, we will wrap up this episode of African American Conservatives. I'm Marie.
I'm DK.
And we're reminding you to go to brightnews.com, go to acons.substack.com. You can find us there. And of course, you'll find our guest today, Leonydus Johnson, because we're going to subscribe to his Substack there. And also you can go to anchor.fm/AACONS. And there you have it. Another episode of African American Conservatives, the soul of the conservative movement.